Ever looked at an old map and wondered how one tiny island, Great Britain, managed to paint a quarter of the world's landmass pink? It seems almost impossible when you think about it. A small cluster of islands off the coast of Europe, commanding territories that stretched from the Caribbean to Australia, from the Cape of Good Hope to the peaks of the Himalayas. The British Empire was, without a doubt, a titan of history. The empire on which the sun never set, a sprawling network of trade, technology and military power that shaped the modern world. From the bustling ports of Hong Kong to the vast plains of Canada, from the markets of Lagos to the factories of Manchester, its influence was everywhere. For centuries it seemed unstoppable, an eternal monument to wealth and prestige. But what if I told you that this mighty empire, this global machine of conquest and commerce, was built on a foundation of sand? What if the very thing that fueled its rise, insatiable greed, was also what brought it crashing down? Today we are peeling back the layers of pomp and ceremony to reveal the economic story behind the British Empire's collapse. It's a tale of ambition, exploitation, and a fatal miscalculation that reshaped the world. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a cautionary tale about the cost of power and how quickly the grandest illusions can crumble. So, grab a cup of tea, get comfortable, and let's dive into how greed didn't just tarnish the crown, but bankrupted an entire empire and changed global history. To understand the fall, we first have to appreciate the scale of the rise. The British Empire wasn't built overnight. It was centuries in the making, driven by merchants, explorers, and a hunger for profit that seemed to know no limits. In the 16th and 17th centuries, English sailors set out to find new trade routes, often under royal charter. What began as scattered expeditions soon became the foundation for an empire. Companies like the East India Company weren't just businesses. They were power brokers with their own armies, currencies, and laws. In many regions, they were the government. They built trading posts that became forts, forts that became cities, and cities that became colonies. Each new outpost was another cog in an expanding global machine powered by a simple idea: mercantilism. Mercantilism was the belief that a nation's wealth was measured in gold and silver, and the best way to get more was to export more than you imported. The colonies became the perfect mechanism for this system. Think of it like a global business where Britain was the CEO. Raw materials flowed in from every corner of the empire: cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, timber from Canada, gold from Africa. These resources were shipped to Britain, where factories turned them into finished goods like textiles, tools, and furniture. Then those goods were sold back to the colonies and beyond, often at prices that made enormous profits for British merchants. This system didn't just make a few people rich, it fueled the Industrial Revolution. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham exploded with new industries. London became the financial heart of the world, its banks and insurance firms underwriting a vast network of trade. The Royal Navy, unmatched in power, protected those routes and ensured the flow of goods and money never stopped. On the surface, it was a golden age. The empire looked like a flawless machine of progress and prosperity, but beneath that shine, cracks were already forming. The truth was that the empire was expensive, eye-wateringly expensive. Maintaining troops, fleets, and governors across 5 continents cost staggering sums. Rebellions flared constantly, and every uprising, every fort, every new territory added another bill to the empire's ledger. So the British government looked for a solution and found one in the colonies themselves. If the empire was to survive, the colonies would have to pay for it. Taxes were imposed on everything from salt in India to tea in America. These weren't small levies either. They were heavy, deliberately so. They funded the army, the navy, and the entire machinery of imperial control. But with those taxes came resentment. Colonists saw their labor and resources drained to feed a distant power. They had no voice in Parliament, no say in how they were governed. It was a clear case of taxation without representation. In America, that resentment turned into revolution. When the 13 colonies declared independence, it wasn't just a blow to British pride. It was a financial disaster. Britain lost access to a lucrative market and the taxes that came with it. Yet instead of rethinking the model, Britain doubled down elsewhere. India became the new jewel in the crown. Its wealth, population, and strategic position made it the centerpiece of Britain's imperial ambitions. But the way it was exploited was devastating. Indian industries that once thrived, especially textiles, were systematically destroyed to eliminate competition with British mills. Local artisans who had built world-renowned fabrics like muslin and silk saw their livelihoods vanish. British authorities forced Indian farmers to grow cash crops like indigo, cotton, and opium instead of food. The result was catastrophic. When famine struck, millions died while British merchants still exported food abroad for profit. The wealth extracted from India was staggering. It built railways and mansions in Britain, but it left India impoverished, and India wasn't alone. Across Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia, the same pattern repeated. Resources were stripped, local economies warped, and generations left dependent on the empire that exploited them. It was a short-term strategy dressed up as a civilizing mission, but the seeds of decline had already been sown. Then came the two world wars. If the empire's economic model was strained before, the wars broke it completely. In World War I, Britain spent billions defending not only its homeland, but its empire. The cost was so high that it began borrowing heavily, especially from the United States. By the time the war ended, the country's debt had tripled, and then, just 2 decades later, it happened again. World War II drained every remaining resource. Britain mortgaged its future to fight Hitler's forces. It sold off overseas assets, drained its gold reserves, and borrowed so much that it went from being the world's biggest lender to its biggest borrower. When peace finally came, Britain was exhausted, financially, militarily, and morally. The empire that once seemed eternal was now hollow. The very notion of empire felt outdated in a world that had just fought to defeat fascism. That contradiction was glaring. How could a country claim to fight for freedom and democracy while denying those same rights to millions under its rule? Independence movements that had been simmering for decades suddenly caught fire. In India, Mahatma Gandhi led a movement of non-violent resistance that captured global attention. Across Africa and the Caribbean, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta rose up, demanding the same freedom Britain claimed to defend in Europe. Britain no longer had the means or the will to stop them. The empire's global military presence was unsustainable. Keeping control meant endless spending, endless policing, and endless bloodshed. The math simply didn't add up anymore. The independence of India and Pakistan in 1947 was the turning point. It set off a chain reaction. Over the next 2 decades, colony after colony gained independence. From Ghana to Jamaica to Singapore, flags were lowered and new nations were born. The empire on which the sun never set finally saw the sun go down, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, through treaties, negotiations, and quiet farewells. The illusion of eternal power dissolved into history. So, what came next? What was left after centuries of global dominance faded away? For Britain, it was an identity crisis. The empire had defined its politics, economy, and sense of purpose for so long that losing it left a vacuum. The country had to reinvent itself, shifting from an imperial superpower to a mid-sized European nation. Economically, the loss was immense. The wealth once extracted from colonies was gone. The trade routes that once flowed only toward Britain now connected an increasingly independent world. The empire's industrial base, once the envy of the world, was aging and inefficient. Post-war Britain was left with debt, shortages, and a struggling economy. The greed that had fueled centuries of expansion now left the homeland hollow. The wealth had been spent maintaining an empire that could never last, and when it finally fell apart, there was little left to sustain the illusion. But the story doesn't end there. The end of empire didn't just reshape Britain, it reshaped the entire world. For the newly independent nations, freedom was a double-edged sword. They inherited borders drawn by colonial administrators who often ignored ethnic and cultural realities. Economies built to serve Britain had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Many faced decades of poverty, corruption, and conflict rooted in the legacy of exploitation. Yet amid the hardship, there was also renewal. Independence sparked waves of creativity, political thought, and cultural pride. Countries began defining themselves on their own terms. They built new institutions, rewrote their histories, and reclaimed their voices. The collapse of the British Empire, driven by its own unsustainable greed, gave rise to the modern, multicultural, and interconnected world we live in. It's a world shaped by both the scars and the lessons of empire. History has a way of humbling even the mightiest powers. The British Empire believed it was eternal, that its wealth and influence would last forever. But power built on inequality can't endure. Sooner or later, the imbalance tips. The empire's story reminds us that greed, left unchecked, consumes everything, even the empire itself. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. It's a vast topic, and we've only begun to scratch the surface. What are your thoughts on the economic legacy of the British Empire? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the stories that shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.